React is one of the most popular JavaScript libraries for creating user interfaces and is a vital skill for many front-end and full-stack developers. In this course, I'll introduce the React library using the most modern syntax and today's best practices for creating React components. My name is Eve Porcello. I'm a developer and author, and I've worked with React for several years. I'm excited to say that React is the most stable and most robust it's ever been. And since so many companies from Fortune 500 to startups have adopted React in production, now is the time to learn it. So let's jump in and learn React. This course will introduce you to the React library, but to be best prepared, there are a few things that might be helpful to know. First, React is JavaScript, so you'll want to know some JavaScript. If you've never been introduced to JavaScript, I'd recommend taking JavaScript Essential Training with Morten Rand Hendrickson. To use React in the most modern way, we'll also be using some ECMAScript or ES6 syntax. I'll introduce these concepts like arrow functions, destructuring, and class syntax as they come up, but if you want a little more detail, you can check out my class Learning ECMAScript 6. Finally, we'll install some packages using NPM, the Node Package Manager. If you haven't used NPM before, you can check out Node.js Essential Training with Alex Banks. This course comes with a set of exercise files that you can download and follow along with. These will give you everything needed to work alongside me in the same files. In the exercise files folder, you'll find a folder for every chapter. Each chapter then has a subfolder for every video where we'll be working on code. And then inside of those, you'll see a start and a finish file. I'll start working with the start folder, and then the finished files will be in the finish folder. I've chosen VS Code as my code editor, which is available from code.visualstudio.com. You can follow along in any text editor or development IDE of your choice. That's all we need to get set up, so let's go ahead and begin our React Essential training. React is a JavaScript library that's used to build user interfaces. With React, we create reusable components, and these components display data as it changes over time. React was created at Facebook and was released initially in March 2013. And since then, React has expanded beyond the web with React Native, a tool that allows you to create native mobile applications using React. Another reason to like React is that they have very useful documentation. If you head over to React.js.org and click on the Docs link, you'll see a bunch of resources for getting started, as well as an official tutorial that the React team has created. React is an increasingly popular library with tens of thousands of stars on GitHub and use in production by huge companies like Uber, Netflix, and Twitter. Throughout this course, my goal is to demonstrate how the approach of React is different and why it might make your work as a developer easier, faster, and more fun. Let's go ahead and install the React Developer Tools. The React Developer Tools are a browser extension that you can install to explore sites, your own or other people's, that use React. So let's go ahead and find these. I'm just going to search Chrome for Chrome extensions. This is typically the fastest way to bring us to the Chrome web store. And then once I click on this link, we should see the option to search here on the left-hand side. I can say React Developer Tools. And the first option here is what we want to add. So if I say add to Chrome and we allow it to add the extension, it lets us know that React Developer Tools has been added to Chrome. If you're a Firefox user, I have some good news for you too. You can install the React Developer Tools as add-ons. In the next video, we'll use these dev tools to further inspect a site that uses React. In this video, we'll take a closer look at the React tools that we previously installed. Here I've navigated to Airbnb. Airbnb is a site that uses React. And I know this because I see the React Developer Tools icon highlighted here in our tab. So what I can do to inspect this is similar to what I do to inspect any HTML on a page when I'm using Chrome. I'm going to open up the Developer Tools. So I can open up Command Option J using my Mac, or if you're using a PC, you can hit F12 or Control Shift J. So once I do this, I'm going to see the console. Now, if I go next door to our Elements tab, I'll see all of the different HTML elements that make up the page. Then, if I go to the right arrow over here and I select React, I can see all of the different components that make up this page. So a React page is just a collection of components, and the React developer tools show us where these components live in the component hierarchy. So we're going to be using these developer tools quite a bit throughout the course in order to inspect our pages that will have a few fewer components than something huge like Airbnb. But this will give us a sense of how these pages are put together, and you should know that you can always go inspect any websites that are using React using your React developer tools. Create React App is a tool that will allow you to set up a React project without any build configuration. In other words, you don't have to set up Babel in order to use the latest JavaScript syntax. That's built into Create React App. You also don't have to set up Webpack or any other tools. Create React App does it for you, so you can just focus on your code. So I love Create React App, and I use it for pretty much every React project that I start. So let's show you how to install Create React App on your computer. Now, the first thing I want to do is open up our terminal. To get started with Create React App, all you need to do is install Create React App as a global dependency using npm. So we've opened our terminal or command prompt, and then from any folder, you can run the following: sudo npm install -g create react app. So the sudo command just runs this as an administrator. The -g means this will be installed globally, so you can use Create React App for any project. So let's go ahead and do this. We will need to enter a password. Now, if you're on a PC, you can just run npm install create react app in your command prompt as an administrator. So now that we have Create React App installed, we will be ready to go. And in the next video, we'll look at how we can use this to generate a project. Now that we have Create React App installed, we can use the package to generate our own React project. So in the terminal or command prompt, we want to navigate to a folder where we can generate the project and work with it throughout the course. This could be your exercise files folder, or you can just place it on your desktop. Okay, so let's get into that folder. We'll look at the desktop. We'll get into exercise files. We'll get into chapter 2. And then finally, I will navigate into O2 start. Okay. So now I can run the command create react app. Now this command is going to generate a project, and it'll generate the project by name. So we'll pick a name here. React is fun. That'll be our hello world to get us started. And as soon as I hit enter, it'll set to work installing all of these packages. Okay, so Create React App gives us a few instructions here. The first instruction is to navigate into the React is fun directory, and then we can run npm start. Now, once I run npm start, this is going to open up a browser window where our React project will be running at localhost 3000. So it might take a second to load up, but we'll see that the spinning React logo means that this is now working correctly, and we should be ready to start our development. So with our project running, we can open the files. I'm going to do so using VS Code. And if I navigate into the O2 directory, we should see the React is Fun project. So let's explore what's going on here. If I open our package.json file, you'll see that there are a few dependencies installed. There's React, there's React DOM, and there's React scripts. Now, React is what will allow us to create components and use the React library. React DOM will be everything needed to take those components and place them in the DOM, so to actually render them to the page. React scripts is where some of the magic happens. This is what's handling all of our transpiling of new syntax into browser compatible syntax. We also have Webpack going on and all sorts of stuff behind the scenes. So React scripts is taking care of that for us. Now, what's responsible for rendering that spinning React logo to the page? Well, that can be found in the source folder. So everything that is in the source folder is really where we're going to work. This is where we're going to make any changes to the React files that we need to make, and this is where we'll create our components. So our project is set up, and in the next video, we'll actually start writing some React code. Let's go ahead and create our first React element. Now I'm in chapter 2, the start folder inside of our React is Fun project, and I've opened the index.js file. Now I'm going to highlight everything here and do something kind of bold. I'm going to delete everything, and let's create this absolutely from scratch. Now the first thing that we'll do is we'll import React from React. This is pretty important. We need to import the React library in order to use it. The second thing that we'll import is React DOM, and this is going to provide us with a render method that we can use to render our React component, our React element to the DOM. So we'll say import React DOM from React DOM. Now the next thing I want to do is create my React element. So we'll call it title, and we'll use React.createElement. And this is going to take in 3 different arguments. The first is the type of element we want to create, and that's an H1. The second is any attributes that we want to provide. So we'll say title, and we'll give it a class name of header. And finally, after we close that curly brace, finally, we want to display any child elements. So if we wanted to create another element here, we could, or we could just add some text, which will be displayed as the child of the H1. So hello world. Now we need to render this title to the DOM. So we'll use React DOM.render, and we'll pass in 2 arguments here. The first is, what do we want to render? We want to render our title element. So that's a simple one there. The second one we need to specify is, where do we want to render this? If you look at the index.html file that's provided with Create React App, you'll see that it includes this div with an ID of root. So in most React projects, kind of because of Create React App, you're going to render everything to an element called root. But this could be called anything. You could call it React container. You could call it pancake. You can call it whatever you want to. We're just using some simple DOM selection using JavaScript. All right, so let's go back to index, and here we're going to say document.getElementById, and where we want to render this is the root. So if you still have your project running, that's great. It will automatically reload any changes immediately, but I need to restart mine. So I'm going to say npm start in this folder. It'll go through the process of rendering this for me. And as this refreshes, we should see that the hello world is now present. How cool is that? We've just rendered our first element to the DOM. So let's open up our developer tools to see what's going on here. If I go to the React developer tools, we'll see that an H1 has been rendered. And look, I have an ID and a class name that I've specified. And then the child of this H1 is just that text, hello world. Let's add another quick feature here. I'm going to create a variable called style, and we're going to specify some CSS styles that we want to apply to this element. So we'll say background color is orange. We'll give it a color, in other words, a text color, white, and a font family of Arial. And I'll place this here in the properties. So I'll say style is style. As soon as I hit save on that, we should see that automatically refresh. Thank you, Create React App, for doing that for us. And you'll see that the style property has been applied, background color, color, and font family. So this is the simplest way to create an element using React. We'll use the create element call to create our title. In the next video, we'll look at a syntax that makes this even cleaner called JSX. In the previous video, we looked at how to render a React element to the DOM. Let's make some adjustments to this to instead render an unordered list. So I'm going to change the H1 to an unordered list, and then I'm going to need to render list items inside of the UL. So this becomes a child of that. So I'm going to add this here as the third argument. React.createElement, li, we'll skip out on properties, and then we'll say the list item should be called item on our list. Now, as soon as I look back at the browser, I should see this item on our list. Now, this is pretty good. This is working well. We're rendering list items. It's pretty cool. But let's think about how we might simplify this a little bit. And what React provides us with is a different syntax called JSX, or JavaScript as XML, which is a tag-based syntax that we can use to create React elements. So instead of having to do all of these create element calls, we can instead use JSX syntax to make this a little cleaner. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to get rid of our title, and instead we're going to work with React DOM.render to render this to our DOM. So what we're going to do is this. I'm going to say h1, and we'll say hello world, and I'll give that a save, and we should see our hello world being rendered to the DOM. Let's go ahead and add some additional tags here. So I'm going to create a div. I'm going to add our h1 here, and then I'm going to add a paragraph next to it. I'll say, we're glad you're here. So as soon as I do this, we're rendering this div to the DOM. Checking this out in our React Dev Tools, we should see our div and our h1 and our paragraph. This is JSX. So this is a tag-based syntax that we can use to render elements to the DOM. And then we can mark it up like we would with any HTML. So let's say we wanted to give our div a style. We could use syntax that looks like this. As soon as I do that, all of our style will be applied. We just set the attribute, and then using these JSX curly braces, we pass in the name of the variable that we want to use for the style. You can also use just simple IDs. So you could say ID heading element, and then this would apply that heading element to that particular element. So if we go down to the h1, we should see an ID of heading element. So JSX will go over some tips and tricks throughout the rest of the course, but this should get us started. It's a tag-based syntax that we can use to skip out on all of those create element calls and instead use this much cleaner tag-based syntax. So far, rendering a few JSX elements to the DOM has gone pretty well. We've even added a style attribute using JSX attribute syntax. The reason that React has become so popular, though, is due to its component-based structure. We create a user interface simply by creating and nesting a collection of components. Let's go ahead and create our first component. So the first thing I'll do is get rid of our style object, and then we'll create a component using React's class syntax. So I'm going to say class message extends React.component. All right, and then I'm going to use an ES6 class to define this component. Now, the most important method, the most critical thing to understand about React components is all of them have a render method. The render method describes what we want to render to the DOM. So within our render method, we're going to add a return. And then I usually like to wrap all of our JSX elements with these parentheses. That helps us save bugs a little bit later. Now, the next thing I want to do here is add a couple of elements, the first being a div, and the second being an h1 that just says hello everyone. And from here, we can render this component to the DOM. So I'm going to replace our divs here on line 15 with our message component. Now, the message component is going to be self-closing, and then we see that it will render that immediately to our DOM. Pretty cool stuff. One thing I want to note is all of our components should be capitalized. So if I give that a save and I open up our console, we're going to see that the tag message is unrecognized. If you meant to render a React component, start its name with an uppercase letter. So this is a change in the most recent versions of React. There needs to be a way to distinguish between just regular JSX elements like our div and h1 and our components. So we always want to make sure to capitalize them. So once I change that back, we should see that rendering appropriately. Currently, we're rendering our message component to the root div. But what if we wanted to make this message dynamic? To do this, we'd use React props. Now, the first step in working with props is to pass data to the message component. So I'll do that here on line 15. Here I'll add a message, and the message should say, "How are you?" All right. So when I hit save on that, nothing happens because we haven't used that property yet. The place I'll use it is here in the H1. So let's use a JSX expression, the curly braces, and we're going to use those to wrap the name of the property that we want to render. So we'll access them via the this.props object, and then we'll access it by key. So message, I should be able to see that rendered in the output. And I do. So the props object can contain as many properties as you'd like. And in a class component, you'll reference them via this.props. Whatever the name of the property is. To get a look at this, we can console log the this.props object. And then if we check out our console, hitting Command Option J, we should see the props object with message as a key. And then however many properties I add here, I can do so directly in the message component. So I could say age, 50. And as soon as I hit save on that, we're going to see the age key added to this object. Now let's try adding another property to do something even a little more exciting. The first thing I'll do is I'll replace age with color equals blue. And somehow I want to take this color and I want to change the color of our text. Now the way that I can do this is I can use a style attribute on the H1. So we can say H1 style equals, and then let's hit enter on this so that we can see everything. So again, we're going to use our JSX curly braces for our JSX expression. The tricky thing here is I need to pass an object, a style object, into this expression. So hence the two sets of curly braces. So here we'll say color this.props.color. Again, accessing that color property off of the props object, and then we're good. We should be able to render that content to the page. Now, the final thing I want to show here is let's add another paragraph tag. And the paragraph tag should have the following. We should write all check back in this.props.minutes. And if we scroll out a little bit, at this point, it's just going to say, I'll check back in blank minutes. Now, I can send this as a property to the message. The tricky thing here, though, is, and we saw it a second ago when I used the age property, whenever we're passing in a number or a Boolean, something that's not a string, we need to use that JSX expression. So if we add our property for minutes, we need to wrap it in the expression, and then we're going to pass in the number. So let's update our project to include a slightly more robust example. So I live in a ski town, and I'm obsessed with skiing, so I want to build a page that will count my ski days for the year. You can customize your data to count anything you want. Days you've exercised, books you've read, national parks you visited, whatever you're most passionate about. So I'm going to go ahead and add this data here to line 4, and I'm going to call it ski data. And we'll just create an object here with a few numbers. We'll have a total number of ski days, a number of powder days, hopefully a lot, a number of backcountry days when we're skiing outside of the resort, and then a goal. So the number of days I'd like to be able to ski per year. Now the next thing I want to do is create a component called a ski day counter. So we'll go ahead and replace the message component with that. So ski day counter is again going to extend React component. And let's go ahead and render the following. We'll just simply render a section with ski days. And then instead of rendering the message, let's render the ski day counter component, ski day counter, and we'll use that self-closing tag. Awesome. So the component is rendering okay, but we want to be able to render some data. So let's pass some props to the ski day counter component. If I zoom in a little bit, I'm going to add a few different properties. The first is total, and we're going to find that data from our object. So ski data.total. We then will say powder equals ski data.powder, backcountry, and goal. Cool. So now what I can do is add these tags to the section. So let's display some data here. The first thing I want to display is our total. So we'll display all of these in a paragraph. We'll say total days. This dot props dot total. And then I'm going to create 4 different divs for my 4 different data points. So I'll just copy and paste all of them. We'll call this powder days. And we'll say this dot props dot powder. We'll add another div. We'll say backcountry days. This dot props dot backcountry. And finally, our goal. Cool. So on save, I should see all of our data rendering properly. Now, one little thing that we can do to make our code a little bit more concise is something you'll see a lot of folks do. I can destructure our component. So now our dynamic data is displaying. Now, one thing I want to do to kind of shorten up our code, make it a little bit more concise, and also to match a lot of syntax that you'll see in other tutorials or in documentation is this. So I'm going to add a comma here, and I'm going to destructure component from React. This means that I can get rid of React.component here and just instead use the component. Now, it used to be the case that you could get away with getting rid of React. If I hit save, though, we're going to see an error pop up right away, a pretty gnarly error, which says that React must be in scope when using JSX. So you always need to. In addition to properties, we can add methods that are local to these components. Currently, we're displaying our goal value, but I actually want to calculate how far I am toward reaching my goal. Am I 50% there, 10%? How am I doing so far? So to do this, let's create those methods here within our class component. Now, the first one is going to be called getPercent. And getPercent is going to take in a decimal, and it's going to return the following. We're going to say return decimal times 100, and then we'll concatenate on a percentage symbol. Next, I'm going to create another one called calc goal progress. And calculate goal progress is going to take in the total number, the goal number, and it's going to create a percent. So here we'll say return this dot get percent, and we'll divide total by the goal. Now we can use this within the component. So we'll say this dot calc goal progress, and we're going to pass in total and goal as our arguments. This is going to return that percent. Now, the final thing I can do is I can say goal progress, so we can have a little more clarity on what we're trying to do there. So this is how we would add custom methods to a React component using an ES6 class. We're using these custom methods right here within the context of the component. So far, we've created components as ES6 classes, but that's not the only way to create a React component. You can also create a component as a function. So using the JavaScript syntax we know and love, we can create a JavaScript function that returns JSX elements to be rendered. So let's explore that a little bit. The first thing I want to do is create a function called ski_day_counter, and this is going to be an arrow function that returns some JSX elements. Now we can just straight up steal these from our neighboring component here. So I will cut and paste them into this component. Now, the next thing I want to do is we're seeing an error because we have the ski day counter defined twice. This is overriding this one, and it's like, what are you trying to return? So instead, I'll just comment that out for now. And then I'll see that total, powder, backcountry total, and goal are not defined. So we're passing these values down, but we're not really accessing them from anywhere. So the way that we access these is with props. So we don't have access to this, so we can't use this dot props, but we can pass down the props object to be consumed by this component. So I can say props.total, props.powder, props.backcountry. And for now, I'm going to replace our function, we'll handle that in a second, with props.goal. So at this point, we see all of our values being rendered. Now, another thing that you'll see a lot of in React code is people will destructure these properties. So what I mean by that is I can remove props and I can use the curly braces to access these props by name. So I can say total, backcountry. I guess I should do them in order. You don't have to, but just for clarity, we'll add goal as well. Still, we're seeing that props is not defined because we don't need it anymore. So we can replace this with nothing here. So we'll delete props. And then as soon as I hit save, we should see these being rendered. Now we're pretty far along. However, we still haven't dealt with our functions, get percent and calculate goal progress. So let me uncomment this for a moment. And I'm going to take these functions and I'm going to paste them here above the ski day counter. And then I can actually get rid of the rest of my ski day counter class. Now, here's the thing. We can't use these functions inside of another function. So we're going to have to just create these as separate functions. So I'm going to say const get percent, const calc goal progress. And then I don't need to reference this because we're not inside of the context of a component. So I'm just going to use get percent. And then I'll use these functions just as I did before inside of goal progress. But this time I'll say calc goal progress. And as before, I'll send total and goal as parameters. Nice. So we've done a full refactor of our ski day counter component. You can just create components as functions if you're accessing props and if you want to add your custom methods outside of the context of that component. In later videos, we'll talk about how to compose these components together, but for now we should know that we can always use functions to create components. So far, we've created a component and we've created some custom methods to live on that component. Now, really the power of React comes from composing multiple different components. So we're going to adjust this file so that we can account for that. So let's go ahead and get rid of this component. I'm also going to get rid of the ski day counter that's being rendered here. And we're going to replace this with something entirely new. And the new component we're going to replace it with is called library. So library is going to return something fairly simple. We'll say return a div where it just reads welcome to the library. I promise we'll do better than that in a second. And then we're going to render this component here on line 13. All right, so it's rendering appropriately. Now, as far as composing components go, now when we talk about composing components, it might be tempting to do something like this, to render multiple different library components here to our DOM. As soon as I try to render this, though, it's saying that I can't render multiple elements that are next door to one another without wrapping them in a tag. So if I wanted to do something like this, I could. I would just need to wrap it with a div tag. And then I would take the libraries and I would paste them within the context of that div. Now, as soon as I hit save on that, we should be able to see our two components, welcome to the library. But I think we can do even better than this. So let's go ahead and go back to having one library. We're going to delete the wrapping div, and then we're going to create another component here called book. The book component is going to be another one of these function components, and we're going to simply render a section. Remember, you can always render any sort of tag, so it doesn't have to be a div. You can use HTML5 semantic elements, which is probably preferred in a lot of cases. So our book here is going to have 3 different properties. It's going to have a title, an author, and a number of pages. So we just want the book component to display these values. So I'm going to display them in an H2. I'll display title. Here I'll display by author. And finally, we'll say p tag for pages. So the number of pages in this book. All right. So the book isn't being used yet. Let's use this within the context of library. So library here would become the parent component, and it would render the book. So let's go ahead and add this tag, and we're going to pass down some data to the book. We'll say title equals the sun also rises. Author is Ernest Hemingway. And the number of pages is 260. All right, I looked that up. Let me correct my typo here where it says 260 page. However, we're in good shape here. Our library is rendering the book component. It's passing down this data to the book component, its child component, and then that component will display that information. Now let's take this one step further, and I'm going to copy and paste these book components here inside of the library. And we're going to reuse this so that we can display a few different components. So we'll change the name of this book. You can use whatever books you want here. And we'll change the last one, Cat's Cradle by. And finally, we'll change the pages. So here's where React gets really exciting. Our library is rendering 3 different book components, all that contain their own unique data. As soon as I hit save on this, we should see all of these components appearing on the DOM. So this is our first example of composing components. We have a parent component, the library, that displays one or more child components like the book. In the previous video, we looked at how to incorporate the component lifecycle into our app. But let's make our component did mount function a little bit more robust here. So component did mount is a really excellent place to fetch some data, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So first, let's add a couple keys to our state object here on line 37. So I'm going to add a comma here, and then I'm going to add data, which we'll set to an empty array as our initial state. And then we'll set a state of loading as false. Now, the next step I want to take is to adjust our component did mount function to actually change the state to handle the loading of data. So step 1 here, we're going to say this.setState, and we're going to set the state of loading to true. Next, we're going to use fetch, and this is the browser's version of fetch. And we're going to fetch some data from a REST API, and we're going to use this API here. So we'll type https h+sport.com/API/products/order price sort /ASC for ascending, and then we'll pass it a parameter of quantity 1. So this is sort of a long URL, but kind of mimics what it would be like to fetch some data from a REST API, because that's exactly what this is. So from here, we'll take that data and we'll turn it into a JSON format using the data.json function. And then finally, we're going to do something kind of interesting here. So that JSON data, we're going to take it and we're going to set the state of data, our data property, we're going to set that to whatever the response from this endpoint is. So let's go ahead and set the state. We'll say data, and then we'll also set loading to false. Awesome. So literally, if I take this URL and I paste it into our browser, we're going to see that this is the data that comes back. So this data should be the new value of our state data. Cool. So now we can reference this in our UI by making a few adjustments here. So right underneath our hiring block, we're going to add a product block. So this will be kind of interesting. First, we're going to say if this.state.loading is true, then we want to just display a little bit of text that says loading. Otherwise, we want to display a div. Now this div is going to have some content in it. So let's zoom in a little bit. Now we're going to map over whatever this data array is. So we'll say this.state.data.map. And then for every product, we want to return another div. So we'll say return a div. And this div is going to display the library product of the week. So maybe to try to make a little bit of money, we're going to have a special product there. And that product will have a title. So library product of the week. We then will have an H4 that displays the product name. And that's literally pulling it here from the API. And then finally, we will add an image. So we want to display the product image. Let's pull the source from product.image. And we also want to give this a height. So we'll give it a height of 100 just so that it displays appropriately. Cool. So just to recap, we have using our component didMount function, we've set the state of loading to true. Then we go fetch some data from the API, and then we set the loading state back to false. And then based on whatever data that is, whatever the response from the API is, we're going to display that in our UI. So let's take a look at our browser. And we should see that the V-neck t-shirt is now being displayed. So this is pretty awesome. We've used the component lifecycle to fetch some remote data and display it. In the previous video, we fetched some data from a remote endpoint, but you may have noticed that this pop-up warning appeared in your terminal, letting you know that image elements must have an alt prop, either with meaningful text or with an empty string for decorative images. Now, this is coming from Create React App, which has been configured with a linting tool called JSX A11Y. So if you're ever working in a project that's using Create React App, there are several accessibility features baked in. So web accessibility is a hugely important task of any developer. We want to make our websites as accessible as possible. And if we use something like Create React App, it's going to help us and warn us if we're doing anything that could be improved. So if we go back to our code, here on line 71 is where we could add that alt text. So I'm just going to add it here. And I'm going to set the alt text to product.name. And this means that if a screen reader is reading through our images and through our content, then this product name will be read versus just having nothing read. So it'll give a little context about what's on the screen. Let's go back and we should see that that error has been cleared. And if we look at our application, we should see that that's been cleared here too. We also see another warning that's popping up. Each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. So we've probably seen this one before. Let's fix that. Now for this div, I'm going to add a key, and the key will say product.id. So now if we go back, we should see that that's been cleared, and we're in much better shape. We've cleared all of our warnings. So if you want to learn more about accessibility, I encourage you to check out this documentation. The React team has prioritized accessibility, which is really cool because that's what we really all should be doing. So check that out if you want to learn more about how to make the most accessible React apps available. A pretty common question that comes up when dealing with React is how do we handle forms? Let's create a simple form to demonstrate. First, let's comment out all of the code related to our little library app here. And we're going to replace this with a new component. This new component is going to be called favorite color form. Now within this class, we'll add a render method, as we must do for any of our ES6 class components. And here we're going to add a form. This form will have a label for one of our fields that reads favorite color. And then inside of this label, we'll add an input with a type color. So this will give us a little color picker to work with instead of just a plain old form field. The next thing we need to do is make sure that we're rendering our new favorite color form component to the DOM. And we'll just replace that there. And now we have this little color picker and the label. So when we're dealing with a React component and we're trying to handle a form, we're going to use state to help us parse some of these values that are coming from the DOM. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a key here called value, which I'll set to an empty string. Then we're going to create a custom method called new color. So new color is going to set the state for value using set state. And set state is going to take in this object where value will be the key and e.target.value is going to be the new value. So again, this is just whatever that new value is. Now, how do I capture this? We're going to capture this via an on change in the input. So let's add on change as a property, and then we'll add this dot new color to the input. So now I need a way to view this to make sure that this thing is working. So we're going to do a couple things here. First, we're going to add a button called submit. And then we're going to, for our form, say on submit equals this dot submit. So what is this dot submit? This dot submit is a new method that I'll create that's going to take care of logging this to the console. So we'll take in the event, the form event. We will log our new value to the console. So new color, we'll use a template string here to display this dot state dot value. And then we're going to say e.prevent default, which is going to prevent the behavior of the form in the browser where we do this weird refresh thing. We don't want that to happen. We just want to prevent the default behavior of the form. Okay, so let's see how we're doing here. Let me open the console. We're going to select a color and we're going to cross our fingers that we can save the value appropriately. So if everything works, we're going to see the hex value pop up here in the console, meaning that we could take that value and send it to a database. We could display it. We could do whatever we want, but it is working. So this is exciting stuff. As soon as I select a color and click submit, it's going to log that hex value of the color for us. So there's a lot of other cool things you can do with React Forms, but these are kind of the basics. We can use state to set up an initial state for this value. And as new values come in from a form, we can parse them and do with them what we want. Let's make some adjustments to our library app to make it even more ready for production. So I'm going to take everything that I've commented out before and uncomment it. I also will get rid of the favorite color form. We'll say goodbye to that and instead render the library. And we'll make sure to pass books as a property with a value of book list. Great, so now we're back to where we were. The next thing I want to do is scroll to the top of our library component. And right beneath our, or right above our state rather, we will add a static property called default props. And default props is going to have a key of books. and it'll have a value of just a simple object. So we'll say title, and we'll say Tahoe Tales, author, Chet Whitley, and finally, pages 1000. At this point, we've added default props to our library component. Now, what's the point of this? Well, we're adding this so that in the event that there's no value available for books, we're going to use this default value instead. So let me show you how that looks. I'm going to get rid of the books property here on line 101. And we're going to see that the Tahoe Tales book that we just added is being displayed. So instead of things breaking, instead of our application breaking down because we don't supply those data values, instead we're going to just display the defaults. We can also add default properties to the book component. So this will look a little bit different. Let me go back to add our book list back in just for now. And we're going to go to the line where we are setting up these properties. So here on line 11. Now here for our title, I'm going to say no title provided. For author, we'll say no author. So pages will set to 0, and I'll give that a save. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments to our book list. So let's say I don't have a value for pages for our first title here, Hunger. If I hit save, we're going to see that the default value is supplied. Same goes for author. If I get rid of the author of this book and I hit save, we're going to say no author. So in a class component, we handle props by setting up this static property. And then if no values are provided for these things, I can supply them. And then in a function component, we're going to use the default arguments syntax, and those values will be provided in the event that they are not otherwise. So I'll go back to our original data here so that that will display as expected, but it's always a good idea to supply these values in case they're not provided for whatever reason. This will allow your UI to still render as expected. In the last video, we looked at how default props can be used to supply values when other values are not provided. Another nice property checking feature that we can include is prop types. So let me show you a situation where these might come in handy. So here on line 4, our book list is an array. Let's change this to being an object of objects, and we'll say books is the key for this object, and it's returning this big array. There we go. So let me give that a save. Now, pretty immediately, we're going to notice that books.map is not a function because we're trying to map over this object, and it's not working like it would for an array. We can't use the array method .map on it. So this might be a nice time for including property types to make sure that all of our properties that are being supplied are of the right type. So let me hit Control Z a few times to get back to our book list array. So there we are, back to normal. This is rendering as expected. And we're going to import prop types from prop types. So this is a separate package. So let's go ahead and install this. So I'm going to hit Command T to open up a new terminal tab. And I'm going to run npm install prop-types --save. So this will take a second to install, but as soon as it does, we will have this available to us. And I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom of this file so that we can set up our prop types. I'll say library.proptypes equals books. So this is the property for our library. And we're going to say prop types.array. So this is going to say that if any other value is not supplied, then we should throw an error. So again, if I go back to, let's say, I'll delete the book list and I'll instead just set book list to an empty object, then we're going to have a problem that's twofold. not only can we not map over, but we're seeing a failed prop type, invalid property books of type objects supplied, expected an array. So if I supplied a number, it'll let me know, hey, you got a number there instead of an array. And book list, a string, same goes for that as well. So this is really useful in debugging because it'll help you track down where the problem is. So let me hit Command Z to get myself out of that. And we'll say prop types array. Let's set this up for our book as well. So we'll say book dot prop types equals, and we have a few different ones of these. So title is a property that should be a string. And then we'll say author should be a string as well. Pages is a number. And then free bookmark is a Boolean, and it's just .bool for that one. So now, since I've changed that data, everything is rendering as expected, and these prop types are going to make sure that the right types are provided to all of these components so that we can find any problems more quickly in the event that they're not. Our app is starting to come together, and our files are starting to get a bit larger. So what I want to do is I want to take our current application and I want to modularize it. I basically want to break it down into a list of different components, each in their own files. So the first thing I want to do here is open up our file structure, and I'm going to create a few new files. The first one is going to be called book.js. The second is going to be called hiring.js. And the third one here is going to be called nothiring.js. And finally, we'll have library.js. Perfect. So now I can go back to the index.js and I can start breaking this thing down. So the first thing I'll do is I will grab our book component, and I'm just going to cut and paste this into the book.js file. And at the beginning of this file, I'm going to use the export to make sure that we export this from that particular file. The next thing that we'll do is go back to our index and grab hiring, cut and paste that into hiring.js, exporting it each time we create a new file. We'll grab not hiring and place that in not hiring with an export. And then we'll grab library. So I'm going to grab our library component, and I'll take that and paste it into the library file. And I'll leave the book list here. So let's make sure to place that here. And we'll say export default library. Now we also need to take care of a few imports here. So at the top of this file, we need to import our prop types. So we'll just cut and paste that from our index file. The other thing I want to mention is that anytime you're using JSX, anytime that JSX is in scope, even if you're using just a regular function component, you're going to want to import React. So make sure to always import React at the beginning of each of these files. So let's go ahead and paste that. And we'll paste that here. And we'll paste that in our not hiring file. Okay, and finally, since we've done all of that exporting, we need to do all of the importing. So we need to ensure that we're importing everything correctly. Let's import library from /library. And in our library file, we need to grab the book from book. And then I'll just copy and paste that. We'll replace book with hiring. And then we'll copy and paste hiring and replace that with not hiring. Okay, So let me give that a save. I'm going to make sure that all of these files are saved. And we should be able to go back to localhost 3000 and see that everything is running as expected. So as your files get larger, you don't need to modularize too quickly. You don't need to create multiple files too quickly. But anytime you find that maybe you want other people to work on certain files, or anytime your files are getting a little bit too long to manage, you can always break them down into component files in order to track everything and make sure you're keeping everything straight. So far, we've created a component and we've created some custom methods to live on that component. Now, really, the power of React comes from composing multiple different components. So we're going to adjust this file so that we can account for that. So let's go ahead and get rid of this component. I'm also going to get rid of the ski day counter that's being rendered here. And we're going to replace this with something entirely new. And the new component we're going to replace it with is called library. So library is going to return something fairly simple. We'll say return a div where it just reads welcome to the library. I promise we'll do better than that in a second. And then we're going to render this component here on line 13. All right, so it's rendering appropriately. Now, as far as composing components go, now when we talk about composing components, it might be tempting to do something like this, to render multiple different library components here to our DOM. As soon as I try to render this, though, it's saying that I can't render multiple elements that are next door to one another without wrapping them in a tag. So if I wanted to do something like this, I could. I would just need to wrap it with a div tag. And then I would take the libraries and I would paste them within the context of that div. Now, as soon as I hit save on that, we should be able to see our two components, welcome to the library. But I think we can do even better than this. So let's go ahead and go back to having one library. We're going to delete the wrapping div. And then we're going to create another component here called book. The book component is going to be another one of these function components. And we're going to simply render a section. Remember, you can always render any sort of tag, so it doesn't have to be a div. You can use HTML5 semantic elements, which is probably preferred in a lot of cases. So our book here is going to have three different properties. It's going to have a title, an author, and a number of pages. So we just want the book component to display these values. So I'm going to display them in an H2. I'll display title. Here I'll display by author. And finally, we'll say p tag for pages. So the number of pages in this book. All right. So the book isn't being used yet. Let's use this within the context of library. So library here would become the parent component and it would render the book. So let's go ahead and add this tag and we're going to pass down some data to the book. We'll say title equals the sun also rises. Author is Ernest Hemingway. And the number of pages is 260. All right, I looked that up. Let me correct my typo here where it says 260 page. However, we're in good shape here. Our library is rendering the book component. It's passing down this data to the book component, its child component, and then that component will display that information. Now let's take this one step further. And I'm going to copy and paste these book components here inside of the library. And we're going to reuse this so that we can display a few different components. So we'll change the name of this book. You can use whatever books you want here. And we'll change the last one, Cat's Cradle by. And finally, we'll change the pages. So here's where React gets really exciting. Our library is rendering 3 different book components, all that contain their own unique data. As soon as I hit save on this, we should see all of these components appearing on the DOM. So this is our first example of composing components. We have a parent component, the library, that displays one or more child components, like the book. In the last video, we showed how to compose components, how to use the library component to display multiple different book components. Let's make this a little bit more of a real-world use case by creating an array of data and then displaying books based on that data. So let me show you what I mean by that. We're going to create a value called book list, and this array will contain objects that describe these books. So again, use whatever books you want at your own discretion. We then will add author, and finally we'll add pages, which is 260. Now I can take this and copy it and paste it a couple times just to save us a little time. We're going to replace this with white teeth. And of course, your data is probably coming from some sort of database or external file, so hopefully you don't have to type it all every time. All right, so this is our database right now, our array of data called the book list. Now, at this point, I'm going to scroll down to our render method, and in the library tag, we're going to pass down book list as a property called books. So books is going to take book list. So basically, I'm just making all of that data that I created accessible within our component tree in the library and in the book. All right, so inside of this library component, we're going to pass down books using our property syntax we used before. So I'll say books, and then instead of rendering these 3 static books, we're going to render them based on whatever the data is. So I'm going to take one of these and paste it here simply to use it later. And the next thing I'm going to do is within our div, we're going to use another JSX expression. Now, this one we're going to use books.map, and we're going to map over all of the books that are in that array. For every one of those books, we're going to create a book component. So I'll take our book and I'll paste it back in here. We don't need to use the braces with ES6 if our arrow points directly at whatever we're returning, which is pretty cool. So let's replace all of these strings. We'll say book.title, book.author, and book.pages. All right, so if I give that a save, we're going to see the same text here. And let's clean these up a little bit so that we can read them. So our book has a title, it has an author, and it has pages. Each of these are being driven from props, which come from the book list itself. So since this data is dynamic, if I add additional records to my database or whatever my data source is, it's going to reflect this. So I could add another book, and I wouldn't have to change anything about the library component. Instead, it's just going to map over how many books there are. If there's one book, it'll return one book. If there are 10,000, it'll return 10,000. So we should see all of this being loaded as we expect. Let's open up the console real quick, though. We're going to see a warning here that says that each child in an array should have a unique key property. Now, we need to add a key to each dynamically rendered child. So this serves as a unique identifier, which will help track which of these components are updating and rendering with React. So the place we'll do this is here on line 25. Instead of just sending in book, we're going to send book and I. We're going to add this key, and the key will just be set to I. So now we've cleared the warning. So now all of our books have a unique key, which will help with rendering. And now our React UI is a reflection of our data. As we add books to our library, to our database, we'll dynamically display nested components within the parent component, the library. One of the most important concepts in React is state. Components can have a local state, but in order to use this, we need to use an ES6 class component. So to demonstrate this, let's update the library component to be an ES6 class instead of a function component. So this is always fairly easy to refactor. We're going to replace line 21 here. We'll say class, library, extends React component. And then we're going to add the critical render method. We have to have that. And then we'll take everything that has been returned here and simply place it in the render. And I see that we have an extra curly brace there, so let's delete that. And it says that books is not defined. That's okay. The thing we need to do here is, instead of passing down props to our function, we're going to access them via this. So we'll say const books equals this.props.books. That will work well, but a shorter syntax that you can use here is to use ES6 destructuring. So I'm going to replace books with books destructured. And then we're going to destructure this from the props object. So from this.props versus this.props.books. So this will work in the same way, and it'll allow us to use books without having to add this.props right here. So one way to add local state to this component is to use the constructor method. I'm going to add this here on line 22. Now the constructor is going to take in props. We're going to use this super method here, which is going to create a new instance of this class. Then we can add a state value. So I'm going to say this.state. Now state is just going to be an object with several different keys on it, similar to props. But this is going to have information about whether our library is open. So I'll say open is true. And then we can display the value of this.state.open within our component by referencing this.state. So let me show you this first. Right before we destructure books in our properties, I'm going to console log this.state. So again, state is just an object, and it has as many keys as you set up, and then you can use these values within the context of your component. And you can also change them, which we'll get to a little bit later. So inside of our div, right above the mapping over the books, let's add an H1, and we'll say the library is this.state.open. So we'll test to see if this.state.open is true. If it is, we'll return open. If not, we'll return closed. So this is a little bit of conditional rendering here that we can use with this inline or ternary if statement. All right, so this is being displayed as we expect. If I ever update that value, our UI will reflect whatever the state is. Excellent. So in the next video, we're going to learn how to change the state using setState. We know how to add state variables to our React applications, but how do we change state? Well, we're going to use a function called setState, which is going to change this state variable within our component. So let's go ahead and add a method here that will trigger that change in state. And it's going to be called toggle open closed. So toggle open closed is going to have this function called setState. SetState is going to take in an object which resets the state. So it'll have a key called open, matching our state variable, and then we'll do whatever the opposite of that is. So in this case, it's false. We'll say open, setState will change it to the opposite, so true. All right. The next thing I need to do here is whenever we're using a constructor method, we need to bind this. So in other words, I need to say this.toggle open closed, and we'll set this equal to this.toggle open closed dot bind this. What this will do is it'll make this accessible within the context of this custom method. So now that I've done this, I can trigger this using a button. So I'm going to take a button and place it here inside of our div. And we'll give it an on-click handler to trigger that function. So we'll say this dot toggle open closed. And then let's give the button some sort of value. We'll say change. And actually, it's at the bottom there, and that's going to get lost in the shuffle. So let me cut and paste this at the top right underneath our H1. Cool. So now I can click change, and this will toggle it open and closed, always resetting the state variable for this component. Set state is asynchronous. So if you are relying on the previous state to set a new value, you can use a callback function inside of set state. So I want to refactor this just because if you're working with other people's code, you're going to see a lot of callback functions instead of objects here in the set state function. So let me show you what this would look like. We're just going to say previous state. When working with a React application, it's a good rule of thumb to keep state in the root of the tree. In other words, your root component, in this case the library component, should hold all of the state variables and pass down that information to the children. You can read more about the idea of lifting state up or having state at the root in the React documentation. So the reason for this is if I have local state in all of my components, it's really easy to lose track of that state and for some of these variables to be incorrect. Sometimes the state at the root is called the source of truth, and you want that source of truth to always be in the same place where you know where to find it. So we're going to add another state variable here to the library, and the state variable that we're going to use is called free bookmark. Now free bookmark is going to be set to true. Let's also change our open variable to true as well. Now the free bookmark state variable, we want to pass this down to the child of the library, which is the book. So let's go ahead and do this here on line 46. We're going to add free bookmark. And this is going to, instead of using properties here, we're going to pass down state data. So we'll say this.state.free bookmark. All right. So then how do I access this information within the context of the book component? Well, I'm going to do so by adding another value here. So I'm going to say p free bookmark today. And we've passed down free bookmark from state. So we're saying, okay, whatever is the state value for free bookmark, let's make that available in the child. But the way that we access that in the child is we're going to access it via props. So we're passing down state as props to the child component. So here on line 17, we're going to just say free bookmark. So if free bookmark is true, we're going to return yes. Otherwise, we're going to return no. Now, after I close my paragraph tag, we need to make one final change. And that's to actually pass down free bookmark so it's accessible in the component. So this is going to say yes for free bookmark today. As soon as I change this to false, it's going to say no. So again, we're passing down state from the parent component. We're keeping this as the source of truth in our application. And then our child component, the book, is going to display that data from props. We've already used a bit of conditional rendering in our app. Here we use a ternary if statement to see if this.state.open is true. If so, we will display open. If it's false, we'll display closed. This same pattern of conditional rendering can also be used with components. We might want to display different components given different conditions. For example, let's create a couple of quick display components here. Now, the first of these is going to be a function called hiring, and hiring is going to return the following. Just a quick note about the syntax for these function components. With our book component, we're using the arrow function and we're wrapping all of these JSX elements with a return statement. Now, we can always create our function components like that, but sometimes you'll see components created like this. Instead of adding the extra curly braces in the return, you can return these directly. So I could say div hiring or add multiple different lines here. I could do something like this where we're returning a larger tree. So I just wanted to point that out because you don't always have to use this syntax. If you'd prefer to keep things a little more minimal, you always can. So hiring is going to be this div with a paragraph that reads, the library is hiring. Go to www.library.com/jobs for more. And then we'll create another version of this called not hiring. And not hiring will say the opposite. The library is not hiring. Check back later for more info. All right, so we have these two components. They are function components that we can display based on some sort of condition, and that condition is going to be a state variable. So let's add another one of these, hiring false, and let's then display one or the other within our library component. So here on line 49, we're going to add a JSX expression. We're going to check to see if this.state.hiring is true. If it is true, then let's go ahead and return the hiring component. If it's false, let's go ahead and return the not hiring component. So as soon as I hit save on this, it's going to say the library is not hiring because hiring is false. As soon as I change this to true and hit save, it will change it to the hiring component. So this is a very, very common pattern in React. We can use conditional rendering to decide based on a certain condition what component should render and what should not. When you're done putting together your project, you can post it online, and you may want to create a production build to do that. Now you'll notice that when you run create React app, it says to create a production build, use npm run build. This is basically going to create an optimized build that's ready to post on something like Netlify or Zeit or some other sort of hosting provider. So let's do this. We're going to stop the server. We're going to try running npm run build. And when this optimizes, it's going to minify everything. It's going to optimize in order to make this as fast as possible. Now, the next step you'll see here is that the build folder is ready to be deployed, and you may serve it with a static server. Let's take a look at what this looks like in our folder. You should see that there are all of these static assets. We have all these JavaScript files that are in one line, so pretty awesome. The next thing that we can do, though, is we can serve it locally with a static server using an npm package called serve. So let's make sure that this is installed. So we can run sudo npm install serve-g, type in our password, and this will make this available globally for us. And then now that this is installed, we can say serve-s build. So we're going to serve the build folder, and this is going to run this on localhost 5000. So it says that the local address was copied to the clipboard. They're making this super straightforward for us. So now I can go to localhost 5000, and I should see that this is running. So this is a pretty awesome setup. Create React app is giving us yet another feature that we can use to quickly build and deploy our React applications. Well, we did it. We built a mini application using React components, and we learned the basics of working with the React library. You should be able to put these practices to work right away. When you want to dig deeper, there are several courses I'd recommend: React Recipes, React Lifecycles, and React Components, Context, and Accessibility. I'd also recommend keeping an eye on the React blog. This is where they share details about the library and the changes that it'll go through. React is really stable though, so I encourage you to use it and enjoy it on all of your projects moving forward.